Hi all, I'm Dr. Clark here again. For Gen Bio today, we're going to discuss species concepts. Um, so how do we determine whether or not something is a separate species? So if you remember Dr. Wake's research on plethodon salamanders in California, he showed that the salamanders were migrating from north to south. Some took a route along the coast and some took a route along the inlands, avoiding the deserts. Okay? And you have a great diversity of patterns. So some are blotchy, some are poisonously colored, but they look very different from each other. But appearance alone is not enough to determine whether or not something is a species, or is it? Okay? And so for a long time, that was kind of the debate. And even early on, when individuals were determining whether or not something was a species, most of it was done on morphological characteristics or the physical appearance of an organism. And for that reason, when individuals were first naming things, they named things just purely on appearance. And so a lot of times males were named a different species than the female, especially when it came to like birds and fish, where there's a lot of sexual dimorphism, meaning there's differences between the sexes. So you would have like a male ringneck pheasant, which is really colorful, etc., and a female, which is very drab and you couldn't tell that it belongs to the same species. They're being classified as separate species. And so after a period of classifying males and females in different species and then reclassifying them once you found out that they were indeed reproducing together, we had to come up with a species concept. And that's what today's lecture is kind of about, is determining whether or not something is a species. Okay. So first of all, speciation is the process by which species are evolve. Okay? And speciation events, or events of macroevolution, changing into another species, have eluded a lot of scientific evidence, okay? Because it's very difficult to see small, minute changes in an organism that might indicate that you have two separate species. Now, morphological features that are easily visible, the difference between one species on the outside and another species, if you can physically see it, then that's a great deal. But there are so many features that may not be physically visible, yet the organisms are definitely different species. And so we're going to go through some ways at which you can have isolation, but it's not physical isolation. So in some cases, that's exactly what it is. You can visually see there's a difference between those two organisms. But in other cases, maybe it's, the chemistry of their reproductive parts. They just don't fit. Right? Maybe it's the timing of when they hatch or when they reproduce. Right? So the species could look identical to each other, but because one hatches or starts reproduction in the morning and one starts one in the evening, those two populations never encounter each other, so they're isolated reproductively, and thus they'll be, a separate species. So when we start looking at whether or not something is a separate species, the main ingredient to speciation, or to an event of speciation, is isolation. Okay? And that isolation can act upon a group of organisms in many different ways. Okay? So it can act upon a group via natural selection. So there's some characteristic that pops up in one population versus another that natural selection can take part in. It could be the result of sexual selection. So there's a physical characteristic that one of the sexes is attracted to, and normally visual cues, but often it can also be like the singing or dancing of an individual. These are all sexual cues. Or we can even do this ourselves through artificial selection. We can select individuals based on a characteristic that humans are interested in. And all those can drive speciation because you're selecting for a single genotype. And eventually, remember, evolution is just change in genes over time of a population. If you select for it enough, then you've changed the entire population's genes, and thus you've created an evolutionary event. Well, for a long time, we struggled with this. Okay? So Linnaean naming system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, on and on and on. We had somewhat of a okay idea of what a kingdom was or what a phylum was, but when it came to species, it was harder to determine what an actual species was until Ernst Mayr came around and coined the term biological species concept. And basically what his concept suggested was that if you have two groups of organisms and they can mate together and produce viable offspring that can also reproduce, then they should be considered the same species, regardless of their physical appearance, their behavior, these kind of things. Doesn't matter. If you mate the two together, they produce viable offspring, it's the same species. Now, the problem with the biological species concept is it's for sexually reproducing species. So when you deal with things that are hermaphrodites or do asexual reproduction, or maybe they can do asexual and sexual reproduction, you miss a lot of species with the biological species concept. The other thing is humans are very good at moving things around. And so, yes, maybe those groups or those populations were once isolated and they would never come in contact with each other. But now, since humans moved them around and put them together and they produce viable offspring, are we considering them separate species? Or are we considering them the same species, even though they never would have came in together with each other? And that's where the natural population came in. But it's hard to determine if some organisms were naturally in that region because we moved so many species around. And it wasn't just Europeans that were moving species around. Okay? Native Americans, when they came to the United States, they moved species around. And there's pretty good evidence that they moved different plant species around and different animal species around. But there's no documentation that that was moved. And so it's hard to determine, are these separate species or, are they the same species? Okay. But again, speciation, regardless of what species concept we use, I guess you could say most modern biologists tend to use a different species concept, which we call the phylogenetic species concept, which is based on how genetically related are the groups. Okay? And so there's a certain threshold of difference between organisms that would determine whether or not they're separate species. And it also has to do with their ancestral connection. So if they don't have an ancestral connection, but genetically they're maybe just having that non-ancestral connection is enough to determine that they're separate species. So it gets messy, it gets kind of confusing when you're doing taxonomic speciation events and trying to classify whether one species is different than the other. And we'll talk about situations where you have different groups of biologists that we call lumpers, and so they tend to lump a bunch of species together into one species. Or we have splitters that just want to, split species apart as much as they can and give them, acronyms like subspecies and things like that to indicate that they're on their way to being separate species. Maybe they're not quite separate species yet, but they're subspecies. Regardless, we'll talk more about that when we talk about human evolution, because we've done this with humans quite a bit. All right, so that reproductive isolation is really key to speciation. So how do things get isolated reproductively? Well, there's quite a few different ways. There's two main categories. You can have prezygotic isolating mechanisms. So this is before the zygote forms. Before the sperm and egg come together and produce a zygote, some kind of mechanism that prevents the sperm and egg from coming together. Okay? That's a prezygotic isolating mechanism. And then there's postzygotic isolating mechanisms. This is after sperm and egg form or come together, fertilization happens, okay? Or zygamy or whatever it is, depending on the organism, okay? Pollination. So it's after it occurs, okay? The egg, the fetus, the embryo, the zygote doesn't form correctly. Okay? Now, doesn't form correctly has lots of different varieties. It could mean that it's just not viable. It's a sterile organism, produces perfectly good organism that can live a long life. It's just sterile. Or it produces an organism that it has maladaptation for the environment, or maybe the zygote doesn't form at all because the parts don't work. Okay? And we'll talk about both of these examples in a second. Okay? So first, let's talk about the prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms. There they are. So you can have geographical isolation, and we'll go through each one of these in much greater detail. Ecological isolation, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and then just the overall prevention of gamete fusion. Okay, so let's go through each one of these. Geographical is probably the one that's most often cited when we're talking about different species. And so this would mean that there's some type of physical barrier between two populations. So that physical barrier doesn't allow them to breed. And this could be all the way from, man-made objects all the way to environmental disasters or things like that. So you could have a volcano that causes a lava field to form between two populations, and because of either coloration or inability to move, they just can't. They become isolated. Okay? You could have two wetlands, two ponds that form after a river floods, and you have these two ponds that have two populations of the same species in them when it occurs, but because of isolation and no transfer of genetic material, they become specialized. Okay? There's all kinds of ways. Two streams, two rivers, you can have a mountain, two sides of a mountain, you can have an island and a mainland. There's all kinds of geographic isolations that occur and can drive speciation because the gene pools of those populations are isolated from one another. Okay? You can have ecological isolation. So now we're talking about the exact same region. So it could be the same stream, the same pond, it could be the same terrestrial habitat, but there's something that isolates them. So maybe they utilize different parts of the habitat. So you could have like a river, and you have benthic fish that feed on the bottom, and pelagic fish that feed in the mid-water column or the surface. And because they don't occur in the exact same region, they never encounter each other and they never reproduce together. MacArthur, had his warblers that occurred in, trees like spruces and pines and other trees, and found that they were occupying different niches. Right? So they're not actually competing with each other. They don't encounter each other, and that can drive speciation events. So ecological isolation really has to do with same region, same basic habitat, but different ecological niches. Okay? And so you get this niche isolation around ecological isolation. And so you can get an example of that. You have lions and tigers, and lions being on the savanna and tigers being in forested habitat, separate ecological niches. They can roam, they could encounter each other, right? Except for, tigers are suited for the forest habitat, lions are suited for the savanna habitat, and they really never cross each other's path. They don't encounter each other very often until we put them in a situation where they can encounter each other. And so we can, kind of establish mating between the two. You can put the two together in cages and things like that, and they will mate with each other, and they'll produce offspring, a liger or a tyanus, and these are sterile organisms. So this is both a prezygotic isolation in the fact that they're ecologically isolated, but also postzygotic isolation. So their offspring is not viable. Okay? But regardless, they occupy separate ecological niches. They've evolved different coat colors, okay, to establish themselves in these different environments. You can also have temporal isolation. This happens a lot with organisms that might have very quick reproductive periods. So maybe lots of insects go through temporal isolation. So you might have different mayflies, species of mayflies, some that hatch and reproduce in the morning, and then some that might hatch and reproduce in the evening. And because they occur at different times of the day, they never encounter each other. They never mix genetics, and the populations become isolated, and then you kind of have morning hatch, which is one species, and an evening hatch, which is another species. But you can also see this in the same situation across breeding seasons, like fish that reproduce in the spring versus fish that reproduce in the fall. If you put the two together at the exact same time period, okay, you could probably get hybrids, and you could get, even in some cases, viable species. But because they occupy the streams at different times, different breeding seasons, okay, they never cross, their genetics never cross, and you don't have a problem with hybridization in that case. Behavioral isolation, a lot of species interact with each other through some type of behavior, some type of courtship. That could be a dance, it could be a song, it could be, fighting mechanisms. There's all kinds of ways, mating rituals that species recognize. Okay? And that's one way that you can isolate. If the call, say we're talking about a bird call or a frog call or lots of different species calling, say the call is a different amplitude and a different, basic different song. Okay? Some females, normally males are the ones that are calling, some females are not going to recognize that as the same species, okay? Or they might not recognize it at all, and so they won't mate with that individual. And over time, these calls become so specific that only organisms that mate with that individual, that species, are going to mate. And we've seen human interactions with this. There are species of birds, house sparrows in Europe, that occur in urban environments, and species of birds, house sparrows, that occur in rural environments. And the urban environment house sparrows, because they have to sing a different amplitude and different range of notes to kind of get their song across and project their song over normal human traffic and construction and things like that, and just the sounds of a city, because they have to change their song, and they've changed their song so females can actually find them. It's got to a point where the urban house sparrow's song is so different than the rural house sparrow's song that the two don't recognize each other anymore. Now the pieces fit and they could reproduce perfectly fine, but because they don't recognize each other's song, they're starting to become reproductively isolated, and eventually, if this continues, they will be separate species because they will not mate with each other. And there's lots of examples of behavioral isolation. Mechanical isolation, it really just depends on the group of organisms. A lot of times this is could be just the pieces don't fit. In other words, the penis doesn't fit in the vagina. Maybe it's not long enough. It doesn't have enough projectiles, projections off of it to entice mating. Or in plants, maybe the pollen, when it hits when it hits the stigma, that the pollen tube doesn't form correctly. Okay, there's all kinds of mechanical isolations that prevent mating. Okay? And when it comes mechanical, it's really pieces. Now, it might not even be the sexual reproductive parts. It could just be the size of the organism. One organism is much larger than the other, and it doesn't work. Okay? And then there are prevention of gamete fusion. So pieces might fit, but you might have a vaginal cavity that is too acidic or too basic, so the sperm can't live in it, so you never get fertilization. It could be that the proteins on the outside of the sperm don't fit with the proteins on the egg, and you never get the sperm entering the egg. So the binding and the lysine doesn't work correctly, and that prevents gamete fusion. So these are all isolating mechanisms, or what we call prezygotic isolating mechanisms. Postzygotic factors means that the sperm has actually entered the egg. Okay? Now, these mechanisms, it depends purely on the organism, the group of organism, and what is going on, I guess, after fertilization, okay? Or what the difference is. In some cases, it's a chromosomal difference. So maybe the chromosomes are different sizes or a different number. Okay? And so hybrids, don't form because you don't have the right number of chromosomes. One species has more than the other, and so you have this odd number of chromosomes when the sperm and egg come together, and you don't get any development. In some cases, though, the hybrids will be close enough that you might get some development, but they don't develop normal. So you could have a hybrid that forms that is a disadvantage. Okay? So it doesn't last very long in the environment. Or in some cases, you have hybrids that are almost identical. It's kind of a perfect cross between two species, but they're completely sterile. Okay? And so there's lots of ways in which postzygotic factors can happen. Okay? The division of the cells might not ever happen, so embryonic development never happens. Other times, it just doesn't happen correctly, and the reproductive parts don't form correctly, so those organisms become sterile. And postzygotic isolation occurs in different species. Leopard frogs or Lithobates pippins in North America have a pretty good example of postzygotic isolation. They will mate with each other. They'll go through amplexus. Okay? They can recognize each other's songs, but when the sperm enters the egg, okay, nothing occurs. So the cells, the embryonic cells, do not divide correctly because there's a little bit of difference in chromosomal activity, and the proteins just don't work together. And so you get this isolation. So even though there's really no prezygotic barriers between these guys, there's still postzygotic isolation. So you get these different species of leopard frogs.